Well, good morning, folks. Good morning. There we are. How are you doing today? How are you doing today on this less than less than perfect day? That's for sure, at least from my point of view. I prefer things a little bit brighter and sunnier, and most of all, warmer. But hey, it is what it is, right? Anyway, I'm Brian. I'm the pastor here at Christ United Methodist Church in Waynesboro, and it is Monday, May 10th. And oops, excuse me, one moment. Keep forgetting to turn down that speaker when I go live because it comes out from over there, and I'm afraid it's going to pick up on our thing and interrupt our sound. Anyway, I'm going to start over then. Hi, I'm Brian. I'm the pastor at Christ United Methodist Church in Waynesboro. Waynesboro sits just inside Pennsylvania. We're only a couple miles from the Maryland border. I'm the pastor here. Been here for 2 years. That's my privilege, my honor to be the pastor here at Christ UMC Waynesboro. And I'm looking for people to check in. I see we have a couple. Facebook gives me a number, tells me how many people are watching or how many people are logged in, how many accounts, but I like to put names to that and faces to that. So what I would ask you to do is to check in, say something in the comments section, say hello, say good morning, either to me or to each other as others join in. And yes, I see that's happening. So we'll do our romper room roll call. Somebody said it was like romper room roll call. Good morning, Pat. It's good to see you this morning. So what I've been doing for a few months is reading basically a chapter a day from various books of the Bible, and kind of. I mean, it seems like I'm all over the map, but I'm kind of going back and forth between New Testament and Old Testament. So we did the book of Luke in December, and then we moved right into Acts. We stayed in the New Testament for a while, and that was because that was the second book written by Luke. Then we moved to the Old Testament to Exodus. Then we moved back to the New Testament to Mark. So we're going to move back to the Old Testament. We're going to Genesis. Now, some folks may think, why would you read Exodus before Genesis? Genesis is the first book of the Bible. Well, as I said then, and so some of you, this might be a refresher, but for others it's not, and that's fine. That's cool. That's why I do this kind of stuff. I try not to take anything for granted. I try not to assume too much about what's going on, but I forgot to hit mute on that. So I try not to assume too much. I try to make sure I'm as explanatory as possible and things. Good morning, Cindy and John. Yes, wonderful, good thing. Yes, the prayers are continuing for you folks. That's for sure. So where was I? I did Exodus first because Exodus. The Exodus contains the oldest writing in the Bible. It's the oldest stories in the Bible orally, and it contains literally the oldest of the oldest stories in the Bible. The songs of Miriam and Moses are considered by most biblical scholars to be the oldest parts of Scripture. And in looking at the Bible, the story of the Exodus is foundational for Judaism. Therefore, it should be foundational for Judeo-Christians as well. And Genesis then serves the purpose of explaining why the Exodus happened. It explains why these people ended up in Egypt, how these people ended up in Egypt, and explains who is this Hashem, who is this God, who is this Yahweh, and why is this God interested in these people. And why would these people need this God to be the kind of of God that she is. So Genesis is like a prologue to Exodus and to the rest of the story. So I felt it was important to do Exodus first. Plus, Exodus tied in so well with Lent and all of that. So we're going to be doing basically a chapter a day. Some days we might go just a little bit more than a chapter. For instance, today we're just going to add on a couple of verses. Whoever came up with dividing the chapters, they didn't consult me, and in some cases they put them in the wrong spot. So chapter 1 should actually include, I think it's the first two verses of chapter 2. We'll know for sure when we get there today. To truly finish the first story. So I'm going to take a sip of coffee. Yes, my background is truly out of this world today. Nothing? Okay. So just a few things in going into this. Okay, a few things going into this, and for some of you, this will be a refresher. Let's look at it that way, as a refresher. The stories in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, especially in the first few books and it's not even that. Forget I said that. The stories in the Old Testament, other than the prophets, perhaps, come from various traditions, various sources to come together to create the stories. Now, you'll often hear the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, as the books of Moses. When we hear that, we might misunderstand and think that Moses wrote all 5 of those books. Moses didn't write those 5 books. Yes, there are going to be some people that say, "Oh, yes, he did. Yes, he did. Yes, he did." He didn't. It includes his death, and it includes stuff that took place after his death. So right off the bat, how could he have written it, right? But they're referred to as the books of Moses because of Moses's import in those books, especially Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Excuse me. Not so much in Genesis because he wasn't alive yet. And all 5 of those books were written much later than Moses's life. They didn't coalesce, they didn't come together as they are now until many years after Moses's death, centuries after Moses's death. So that's one thing to know about it. So if he didn't write them, or if a person didn't write them, how did we get them, right? How did we get the books of the Bible? Well, they came from various sources. And again, it's important to remember that most of these stories were shared, not most, all of these stories were shared orally before they were ever written down. They were oral traditions, oral stories. And so they came from various traditions, various sources, various groups. Some are referred to as, you'll hear different words, the Elohist tradition, the Yahwist tradition, the Deuteronomistic tradition, and the priestly tradition for some. Don't worry, those aren't on the final exam. Spoiler alert, there is no final exam. But the different traditions had different purposes, different reasons for telling their stories, and their reasons helped to shape their stories. So as we go through, from time to time, I'll point out some of those stories, what we believe the sources were for some of those stories, and I think as we go along, you'll understand that better, and I also think you'll start to pick up on it and point it out yourself. I'm just going to check in over here. Got a couple more people checking in. Awesome. Good to hear. Good to see. So we're going to go to the book of Genesis. My Old Testament professor, she was wonderful, great person. We have a tendency to think about fact. She said the Bible is loaded with truth, not necessarily with fact, especially when we're looking at especially when we're looking at Genesis as a whole, but most especially when we're looking at the first few chapters of Genesis. So what's the difference between fact and truth? Facts are things like 1 + 1 = 2. Facts are on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence kind of thing, although that might actually be the 5th and stuff like that. But you know what I mean? Those are facts. I was born on August 3rd, 1965. That's a fact. So data are facts. Data are facts. But the difference is, and facts are definitely true. Facts are true. Facts are true. But truths aren't necessarily facts. A truth is something that really cannot be expressed in such a simple form as 1 + 1 = 2. Truths, and a truth has a higher purpose. A truth has a higher purpose, especially scriptural truth. So I would say that the Bible is filled with truth, but it doesn't necessarily have lots of facts in it. Okay, there are facts. Don't get me wrong. There are things that are factual, but sometimes we're looking for facts when the purpose of a story isn't to tell about fact, but truth. We're going to see that right off the bat with the 2 creation stories. The 2 creation stories. What? There are 2 creation stories? Yes, there are 2 creation stories. We typically miss them because we read too quickly and we jam the 2 together and we read it as one story of creation, when in fact there are 2 stories of creation right up front, telling 2 entirely different stories. I'm going to use a word that you might be offended by at first. Allow me to explain. The stories of creation, rather than thinking of them as historical fact, think of them as myths that explain truths. Now, we use the term myth, or you hear the word myth, and you might think, oh, that's a bad word. That means it's fake or whatever. Well, yes and no. Yes and no. Here is a definition of myth from Merriam-Webster. Okay, a myth is a usually traditional story of outwardly appearing historical events that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people, or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. In other words, a myth is a story used to explain something that otherwise is inexplicable. Okay, it's our best way to explain something that we don't understand. So let's look at the creation stories rather than as historical documents explaining how creation took place, and look at them as myths that explain why creation took place and who caused it to happen. You heard what I said there. I'm sure you did. I'm sure you picked up on that. Those are several different questions to ask. We get wrapped up in the how of creation when that's not the purpose of the stories. That's not the purpose of the stories. The idea of reading the creation stories literally is relatively new. It's relatively new. It really started in the 18th century, the 1700s, in particular in the latter part of the 1700s. This would be the how historians refer to that time just slipped out of my head. the period of great, it's the age of reason. There we go. The age of reason came along and started to question everything. And as a result, they started to read that. They read the creation stories very literally. And Christians started to read it very literally. Not so much Jews. Not so much Jews. Yes, there are certain branches of Judaism that do read it literally, but most do not. And as far as Christians, the group of Christianity that still tends to read it very literally is American. Certain branches of American Christianity tend to read the creation stories as one story and literally. Most other Christian denominations around the world do not, and so they don't get hung up on it. They don't get hung up on it as much. But John Calvin, the 16th century, 16th century, might have been into the 17th century. I forget now when he was born and died. He said, this is an exact quote, so it's a slight paraphrase of what he said, but he said, anyone who reads the creation story literally is a fool. Now, what he meant by that is that you're missing the point if we read it literally. So, although you may have been told to read it literally, I'm asking you to not read things literally, especially for these few days as we get started. Now, PB, will you shut up and get started, right? I think that background is important, and it'll help us as we read, as we go forward. So let's look at Genesis chapter 1 and the first couple of verses of chapter 2. Yes, today's probably going to be a slightly longer session than we normally do, because I'm going to have to pause a lot, I'm sure. In fact, right off the bat, you're probably familiar with the very start of this story, of this chapter. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Pause. Why do I pause? Right? Why do I pause? Well, your Bible may even have a footnote there, with some alternate explanations or meanings of the Hebrew. We typically translate it as "in the beginning." Well, if we're reading this, especially if we're reading this literally, but even if we're not, we think then this must be the very beginning of time. The very beginning of time, that nothing was there, perhaps not even God. In the beginning, it's when everything started. Well, no, because the alternate explanation, the alternate translation says, when God began to create. Pick up the difference there, right? When God began to create allows for time having taken place before this began. In Hebrew, especially in the oldest documents, the Masoretic texts, etc., there's no spaces between words, because material paper was so expensive that they wanted to make as much use of it as possible. So there's no vowels. There's only consonants, and there's no or very few spaces, and no or very few grammatical directions on it, which can be confusing. However, in the oldest documents, there is blank space before this begins. The reason being to remind the reader and to remind all of us to be humble. We don't know everything. And also to emphasize the fact that this isn't the very beginning of the story. It's the beginning of our story. It's the beginning of creation, but it's not the beginning of God's story. Okay, it's interesting. And again, back to my Old Testament professor in seminary. She did a session, not with us, with her when she was teaching Hebrew, with her Hebrew like 101 class, I think it was. She gave them the Hebrew. Because she said in the Hebrew, it literally starts in the middle of a sentence. It starts in the middle of a sentence. It's like the way it's written in Hebrew, it indicates that there is a sentence before this, or there are words before this. And so she gave that assignment to people, and they start translating it that way, as if it's the middle of a sentence, until they start catching on. Oh, and then they change it so that it sounds more like this. Anyway, so when God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Pause. Deep water in ancient cultures, virtually all ancient cultures, but especially in Hebrew culture and Hebrew writing, indicates chaos. So the only thing that exists when God begins to create is chaos. But there's the symbolism here, the metaphor. God's Spirit is over top of the chaos. So again, controlling the chaos. And that's what God is going to be doing throughout creation, controlling chaos, bringing order into existence. And then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. Then he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day and the darkness night. And evening passed and morning came, marking the first day. Then God said, "Let there be a space between the waters, to separate the waters of the heavens from the waters of the earth." And that is what happened. God made this space to separate the waters of the earth from the waters of the heavens. God called the space sky. And evening passed and morning came, marking the second day. Pause. I'm going to pause here. It's translated sky, and oftentimes it is translated sky. Some of your translations may say firmament. I prefer actually the word firmament because of the first half of that word, firm. That better understands the what the author of this story and this part of the story, or authors, were describing, and the early understanding of what the earth was like. Firmament. It's not ethereal like sky. It's not open like sky. This is the best understanding, because this does predate our understanding of the world being round. This does indicate this idea of a flat earth that had ends somewhere, anywhere. And this firmament is like a dome. It's a dome over the earth and over the waters, in particular, over the waters. And yes, there is air, sky between the two, but it's taking some of the water, leaving some of the water here on the land, on the earth, but separating it from the waters above the earth, from the waters above, because that's where rain would come from, not from just water evaporating, forming clouds and coming down, but the idea was that some water was above this dome, this cloud. When we get to the story of Noah, it even says opened the doors in the firmament, or the windows, whatever, to allow the water to rush down. Okay, so it's something hard, it's something rigid, it's in place, it's firmament, and it's separating. It's controlling chaos. It's leaving some of this chaos water on the earth, but separating it from other chaos water. God's controlling chaos. Continuing. Verse 9, then God said, "Let the waters beneath the sky flow together into one place, so dry ground may appear." And that is what happened. God called the dry ground land, and the waters seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the land sprout with vegetation, every sort of seed-bearing plant, and trees that grow seed-bearing fruit. These seeds will then produce the kinds of plants and trees from which they came. And that is what happened. The land produced vegetation, all sorts of seed-bearing plants and trees with seed-bearing fruit. Their seeds produced plants and trees of the same kind. And God saw that it was good. And evening passed, and morning came, marking the third day. Pause. So, earth was just water, waters of chaos. Then God said, separate. And God piled up water in various areas and allowed the land to be there. So again, it's this idea of God controlling chaos and marking boundaries. You can only come this far. You can only come this far. And already producing what the land produces, vegetation. So continuing, 16, then God said, let lights appear in the sky, in the firmament, to separate the day from the night. Let them be signs to mark the seasons, days, and years. Let these lights in the sky shine down on the earth. And that is what happened. God made two great lights, the larger one to govern the day, and the smaller one to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set these lights in the sky to light the earth, to govern the day and night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And evening passed, and morning came, marking the fourth day. Pause. So you caught that, I'm sure. I hope. I was trying to be obvious. God set the lights in the sky because that firmament is firm. It's this like dome thing over top of the water in the earth, and God is setting them in place. This is your spot, sun. This is your spot, moon. And yes, providing for a way for it to move somehow. That's not the important thing, because the how really isn't important. Notice so far, the only thing that's important is why is this taking place and who is doing it? Those are the two questions that are really being answered by the creation stories. And so we're seeing that, well, creation had to happen. So who did it? Well, we're being told that God is doing it. And I'll hold off on my next thought. And that was the fourth day. That was the fourth day. Verse 20, then God said, let the waters swarm with fish and other life. Let the skies be filled with birds of every kind. So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that scurries and swarms in the water, and every sort of bird, each producing offspring of the same kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply. Let the fish fill the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. And evening passed, and morning came, marking the fifth day. No, pause. I want to pause and talk, but I'm going to hold off a little bit. I know, even though I just said pause. Hang on one sec. I just want to see something here. Nope, just me. Am I missing anybody? Nope, I didn't check it. Cool. Hold off on a couple of my thoughts until we get through. All right. Then God said, let the earth produce every sort of animal, each producing offspring of the same kind, livestock, small animals that scurry along the ground, and wild animals. And that is what happened. God made all sorts of wild animals, livestock, and small animals, each able to produce offspring of the same kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, and all the wild animals on the earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground. So God created human beings in God's own image. In the image of God, she created them, male and female. He created them. Pause. In Hebrew, God is not specifically mentioned as male or female. That's just something we've done over the years. Continuing. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground." Then God said, "Look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant throughout the earth and all the fruit trees for your food. And I have given every green plant as food for all the wild animals, the birds in the sky, and the small animals that scurry along the ground, everything that has life." And that is what happened. Then God looked over all he had made, and he saw that it was very good. And evening passed, and morning came, marking the sixth day. Pause. Pause. I know I said we're going to read the first, actually, it's the first 4 verses of chapter 2, and we will, but I want to talk first. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk first, then I'll share my screen. Each day, so this is the first creation story. This is the first of the 2 creation stories. This version of the creation story has God as this creative being who speaks and stuff happens, right? It's kind of cool the way the New Living Translation puts it most of the time. God says, let the earth produce every sort of animal, etc., and wild animals. And that is what happened. It's cool the way that is. Where was I going? I read something that distracted me. Sorry about that. So this first creation story, each day is God speaking and stuff happens. God speaks and stuff happens. So it's demonstrating a God who has this transcendent power. It's describing a God who is distant and is able to make things happen from a distance. By the way, I hate that song by Bette Midler. It's happening from a distance. That God is involved and is the source of it, but it only through this power and this creative power of speaking and things happen. So that's how this first story is set up. When we read the second story tomorrow, we keep this in mind as we're reading the story, and I think you'll pick up on the difference between the two. All right. The other thing to mention, and some of you may already have known this or picked up on it, each day sort of ends with God saying that it was good until we get to day 6. When we get to day 6, God says that it is very good. Now, is it very good because God created humans? No. See, we might think that. Especially if we've got that human egocentric thought process taking place. Oh, it's because God finished with God's best creation. And so that's why it's very good, because humans are very good. No, it's because the cumulative aspect of creation, that when it's all put together, it's very good. That when creation is all together, it's very good. In the last the last verses, last day, God's given the instruction, I've given you all the fruit to eat. You can eat all of the fruit of all of these trees, and evergreen plant. Okay, for the animals, that's what I want them to eat too. Is how we would read that. It's how we would read it. Now we might read that literally and say, so God wanted us to be vegetarians, and God didn't want lions to eat other animals, like smaller animals, and the hyenas to eat what was left over. The purpose of that, the reason for that, the authors to put that in there, is to demonstrate that togetherness of creation. Okay, that we weren't struggling with the animals because we weren't trying to eat them, so that everything worked together. But that changes. That changes. All right. So we could say, oh, it's good to be a vegetarian. Well, that's your choice, be a vegetarian, but that's not what the story is saying. It's another indication of how creation is working together. So I see a question, a point here. Verse 26 is, verse 26, it says, let us make human beings in our image. We don't know, and just Cheryl, I know you're saying the Spirit is the second person. As Christians, we can look at that and say, oh, the Holy Spirit, that it's the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, because as Paul writes in Colossians, which we just did that a few weeks ago, right? That Jesus was there at the beginning with creation, and all things came into being through him, is how he put it. In the Gospel of John, John says, in the beginning was the Word. The logic of God, that was the Son made, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, but that the Word was there and everything came into being through the Word. That's our understanding. We should not put that into this text. I mean, we can put it into the text for ourselves to make it our personal understanding. That's fine, but that's not the intent of the original authors, and currently the people of Jewish faith would not read it that way. It's possible and quite likely that the initial author was referring to other lesser gods or other divine beings, for instance, angels, if you wanted to look at it that way, and that they are part of the us. Okay, the lesser gods and stuff. All right. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen, in which I made some notes, or just we're looking at the 6 days of creation. So rather than reading it as that literal story, reading it as myth, reading it as poetry. Okay, I think this will help you read it. So when you're reading through it, and I could have had you take notes kind of like this, but I thought it would be easier if I just did it for you. So days 1 through 3. Day 1, God creates day and night. Boom. Creates the firmament and separates them from the seas, right? And third day is land. Days 4, sun, moon, and stars, sky and sea animals, land animals. So notice the connection. What's the point here, PB? What kind of connection? Well, day 1. So the first 3 are the story is creating earth, creating sky, creating stars and sun, and all that kind of stuff. Days 4 through 6 is when God is creating. Oh, and sorry, day 3 was land and vegetation. Land and vegetation. I probably should have put that on there. Days 4, 5, and 6 is different. It's the sun and the moon and the stars, and then it's the animals. Okay, but let's look at the connection. Day 1 is creating light and separating it from day and night. But day 4 is when God is creating the sun, moon, and stars, which are creating the day and ruling the night. Day 2 is the creating of the sky, including the firmament, the firmament and the sky in between, as well as the seas. And day 5, which would be the second day of animal kind of stuff, God's creating the sky and the sea animals. Lastly, day 3 is the land, and day 6 is the land animals. So 1 and 4 match up, 2 and 5 match up, 3 and 6 match up. So it's very poetic. It really is. It's very poetic. The authors they did that for a purpose. They did that for a purpose. They're creating this story and this myth as poetry. So finishing up then, we're going to read chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. So the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation, so she rested from all of her work. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because it was the day when he rested from all his work of creation. This is the account of the creation of the heavens and the earth. Period. End. What should have been the end of chapter 1, right? So you can see why I did that, right? Those 4 verses finish the first story. If we don't do that, then we think it's the beginning of the second story, or we think that those 2 stories are just one. They're not. They're 2 very different stories. This fully ends the first story of creation. Okay. I don't think there were any other questions or anything. I hope I didn't miss anything. Sometimes Facebook doesn't show me everything as it happens. Now I'm going to go back in here in a few minutes after we end, and after it's been saved and uploaded as a file that I can review, and I will double check the comment stream to see if I missed any of your questions or thoughts. And if I did, I apologize in advance for that happening. But if it did happen, I'll get back to you in some way. And if I can't, then I'll address it tomorrow, perhaps too, because I'm sure your questions are excellent questions, and others might be thinking or wondering the same thing. But friends, that's all I have for today. Thought it was going to take longer than it did. I'm sure I could have gone a little bit slower on and more picky on things, but didn't want to get carried away. Anyway, my friends, that's it for today. I hope you'll join me tomorrow. I do hope and pray that this has been beneficial to you, that perhaps you've learned something today, or relearned something. Perhaps I said something that helped refresh a memory for you. That's awesome. That's great. I am humbled to think that God is able to use me in such a way. If it has been beneficial, I'll see you tomorrow. And also, if you found this helpful, and maybe you can think of somebody that would also benefit from joining us. They've only missed one day, and of course, they can always catch the video in record mode. I know I have some folks that'll be doing that later today that they were unable to join us this morning. But share it. Let your friends know about this opportunity. Share the stream, or just message them privately, kind of thing. And if people don't have Facebook, they can always watch us on our YouTube page or on our website as well. So thank you for joining me. See you again tomorrow. In the meantime, my friends, keep your eyes and ears, your spiritual eyes and ears open for what God is doing in your life. We do have a very active, living God who is concerned. When you see God's action in your life and in the life of those around you, say, "Thank you, Papa," and then tell somebody, including me. I want to hear it. Have a blessed day, my friends. Be blessed. Bye.